"You stopped being my daughter years ago," my father said, his voice echoing through the polished lawyer's office. "Don't expect a single dollar from this estate." The room fell silent. My younger brother lowered his eyes, pretending to study the papers in front of him. My stepmother leaned back with the satisfied smile of someone who believed a long-awaited victory had finally arrived. I stood perfectly still, refusing to give them the tears they had spent years trying to force out of me. The attorney quietly reached for another sealed envelope resting beneath the first file. He frowned for a moment, then looked at the name written across the front. A slow smile appeared on his face. "There's just one problem," he said, breaking the silence. "She is the sole heir to everything your grandfather owned." Every face in the room lost its color. I watched my father's confidence crumble in seconds. His finger, which had been pointed at me only moments before, slowly dropped to his side. The same people who had erased my name from every family? Celebration suddenly stared at me, as if they had never truly known who I was. At that moment, I realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't shouting back. It was standing quietly while the truth they had buried for years finally spoke for itself. My name is Emily, and for most of my life, I believed family meant loyalty. It took me 33 years to understand that. In my father's eyes, loyalty only flowed in one direction. After my mother passed away when I was 12, he remarried within 2 years. From that day on, our home slowly stopped feeling like mine. My stepmother never needed to shout to make me feel unwanted. A raised eyebrow, a forgotten birthday, or an empty seat at the dinner table said enough. My younger brother became the center of every celebration, every investment, and every dream my father talked about. I wasn't openly hated. I was simply treated as if I were temporary, someone who would eventually disappear. Whenever I earned a scholarship, graduated with honors, or received a promotion at work, the conversation somehow returned to my brother's latest achievement, no matter how ordinary it was. For years, I convinced myself that working harder would eventually earn my father's respect. I visited him on holidays, remembered every birthday, and even helped pay his medical bills without mentioning it to anyone. Gratitude never came. Instead, my kindness became an expectation, something they accepted without a second thought. The only person who ever saw through the silence was my grandfather. He never asked why I looked exhausted or why I smiled through disappointment. Somehow he already knew. Whenever I visited him, he'd remind me that a person's worth isn't measured by how loudly they're appreciated, but by how faithfully they live with integrity. At the time, I thought those were simply comforting words from an old man. I didn't realize he had been quietly watching everything that happened inside our family. While everyone else underestimated me, he was paying attention. And without telling a single soul, he made a decision that would one day expose every lie my father had built our family around. The years that followed were filled with the kind of insults no one could easily point to, yet they left the deepest scars. My father rarely raised his voice anymore. He didn't have to. A dismissive glance across the dinner table or a conversation that ended the moment I walked into the room was enough to remind me where I stood. Family gatherings became carefully choreographed performances. My brother was always introduced as the future of the family, the one who would carry our name forward. I was introduced only if someone asked who I was. More than once, I heard my stepmother tell distant relatives, "Emily has always preferred to live her own life." It sounded harmless, but it quietly erased every effort I had made to stay connected. When my grandfather invited everyone to his birthday each year, I noticed something else. While the others spent most of the evening discussing his properties, investments, and business, I found myself sitting beside him on the porch after dinner. We talked about books, old photographs, and the lessons he'd learned through decades of success and failure. I never asked him about money. It simply didn't matter to me. Those quiet conversations didn't go unnoticed. I often caught my stepmother watching us through the window with narrowed eyes. My father would casually interrupt, saying it was time for everyone to leave, even when my grandfather looked disappointed that the evening was ending. Then came the smallest insult that somehow revealed everything. One Christmas, every family member opened carefully wrapped gifts. When my turn came, there wasn't a package with my name on it. My father looked at me for a brief second before saying, almost casually, "I assumed you wouldn't mind." I smiled, thanked everyone for the evening, and left without another word. As I drove home through the falling snow, I realized something had changed inside me. I had stopped waiting to be chosen. I simply didn't know that someone else already had. The Christmas afterthought stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't because of the forgotten gift. It was because I finally understood that I had been measuring my worth against people who had already decided I would never be enough. From that day forward, I stopped chasing approval. I no longer rearranged my schedule to attend every family dinner. I stopped volunteering to solve problems that were never mine to carry. When my father called only because he needed help with paperwork or a financial issue, I politely assisted if I could, but I no longer expected gratitude in return. I treated every interaction like a business conversation, calm, respectful, and emotionally distant. Instead, I invested my energy where it actually mattered. My career flourished, and I quietly built a comfortable life of my own. The peace I found surprised me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring with an apology that would never come. Then, one rainy afternoon, my grandfather asked me to visit him alone. His health had been declining, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We sat in his library, surrounded by shelves of worn books and old family photographs. After a long silence, he looked at me and said, "Emily, never mistake silence for weakness. I've watched this family for years, and I've seen who shows up when no one is watching." I tried to change the subject, but he gently stopped me. "You've never asked me for anything," he continued. "That tells me more about your character than any speech ever could." Those words settled deeply in my heart. When I hugged him goodbye that evening, I had no idea it would be our final conversation. A few months later, he passed away peacefully. As I stood at his funeral, listening to relatives whisper about who would inherit his fortune, I realized they were preparing for a battle over wealth. I was simply mourning the only person who had ever truly seen me. After my grandfather's funeral, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wouldn't argue over his estate, defend myself against rumors, or try to prove my place in the family. If my grandfather had left instructions, they would speak for themselves. Until then, I would remain exactly as I had always been, quiet. The weeks that followed were filled with subtle pressure. My father called several times, insisting that the family should stay united while the estate was being settled. My stepmother casually suggested that everyone should agree in advance to divide the inheritance fairly before the lawyers complicated things. I noticed how carefully they avoided mentioning my grandfather's actual wishes. Instead, they spoke only about what they believed should happen. I listened more than I spoke. Years of working as a financial compliance manager had taught me one valuable lesson: never make decisions based on emotion when legal documents are involved. Every contract, every signature, and every clause existed for a reason. Assumptions meant nothing. Written instructions meant everything. So I quietly organized every document the attorney requested. I gathered old correspondence, verified identification records, and responded to each legal inquiry promptly. I never discussed the process with my relatives, even when they tried to draw information from me. Whenever they asked what I knew, I simply answered, "The attorney will explain everything when the time comes." Their confidence grew with every passing week. They interpreted my silence as surrender. I let them. By the morning of the estate meeting, I walked into the lawyer's office carrying nothing except a small folder and the peace that comes from having nothing to hide. Around me, my father, stepmother, and brother whispered to one another, already discussing how they planned to use the inheritance. None of them realized the most important decision had already been made months before my grandfather's passing. All that remained was for one sealed envelope to be opened in front of everyone. The attorney adjusted his glasses, broke the seal on the second envelope, and unfolded a single typed document. The room was so quiet that I could hear the soft rustle of the paper. He read my grandfather's words slowly, exactly as they had been written. The first part thanked every member of the family for being present. Then his tone shifted. He wrote that an inheritance should never reward entitlement. It should honor character, consistency, and the person who had remained loyal when there was nothing to gain. The attorney looked up once, then continued. My grandfather explained that, over the last decade of his life, he had quietly updated his estate plan. He had watched who visited without expecting favors, who offered help without asking for recognition, and who treated him as family instead of an investment. Finally, the attorney reached the final paragraph. Under the terms of this will, all properties, investments, savings, and business interests are transferred to my granddaughter, Emily, as my sole heir. Silence settled over the room like a heavy curtain. My father's confident expression disappeared. My stepmother stared at the document as if reading it with her eyes could somehow change the words. My brother opened his mouth to speak, then quietly closed it again. No one argued with the attorney. There was nothing to argue about. Every signature had been witnessed. Every requirement had been properly executed. The documents were complete. My father finally turned toward me, but for the first time in years, he had nothing to say. I didn't smile. I didn't remind him of the moment he told me I had stopped being his daughter. I simply gathered my folder, thanked the attorney for his professionalism, and walked toward the door. Behind me, voices began to rise as my family struggled to understand what had happened. I never looked back. Some victories don't need celebration. They only need the truth to arrive quietly, at exactly the right moment. I expected phone calls after the meeting. I just didn't expect so many. By the time I reached home, my phone was filled with missed calls and unread messages. Some came from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Others came from people who had sat silently while I was dismissed, now insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding. It was remarkable how quickly people remembered my number once the attorney had finished reading the will. My father called 3 times that evening. I let the phone ring. The next morning, he left a voicemail saying we needed to talk as a family. It was the same man who had looked me in the eyes less than 24 hours earlier and declared that I had stopped being his daughter years ago. His words hadn't changed because of regret. They had changed because the outcome had. My stepmother tried a different approach. Through another relative, she suggested that my grandfather had surely wanted everyone to share the estate equally. I didn't respond. The will had already answered that question more clearly than I ever could. In the weeks that followed, the family divided into quiet camps. Some blamed my grandfather. Others blamed the attorney. A few even blamed me, as though accepting a lawful inheritance was somehow an act of betrayal. But something unexpected happened. A handful of relatives privately admitted they had witnessed the way I had been treated for years. They apologized for staying silent when they should have spoken. Their honesty couldn't rewrite the past, but it reminded me that integrity still existed, even if it arrived late. The greatest change, however, wasn't in my family's reputation. It was in my own reflection. For years, I had mistaken acceptance for love and silence for weakness. Now I understood that self-worth doesn't come from being chosen by people who refuse to see your value. It comes from living with integrity, even when no one is applauding. That's why this story matters. Sometimes justice isn't loud, dramatic, or immediate. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried inside a sealed envelope that reveals who people truly were all along. People often ask whether my father and I ever reconciled. The honest answer is that reconciliation requires truth before forgiveness, and some people spend their entire lives avoiding both. Months after the estate meeting, he wrote me a letter. It wasn't an apology. It was a list of explanations, why life had been difficult, why certain decisions had seemed reasonable, why I should understand his position. I read every word, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in a drawer. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to answer. Instead, I focused on honoring the person who had believed in me when no one else did. I restored my grandfather's old house instead of selling it. His library remained exactly where he had left it, and I established a scholarship in his name for students who had lost a parent at a young age. It wasn't about the money. It was about continuing the quiet generosity that had defined his life. As for the rest of the inheritance, I managed it with the same patience he had taught me. Every decision was deliberate. Every investment had a purpose. I wanted the legacy he entrusted to me to grow, not only in value but in meaning. Over time, the anger I had carried for years simply faded. Not because my family deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. I finally understood that revenge had never been about taking something from them. It was about refusing to let their rejection define the person I became. Sometimes I still visit my grandfather's grave. I tell him about the scholarship recipients, the house, and the life I've built. Then I sit in silence, just as we used to. The silence no longer feels empty. It feels like home. My father once said I had stopped being his daughter years ago. In the end, I didn't lose my family. They lost the only daughter, who never stopped loving them, and that was a loss no inheritance could ever replace.